The shirt was already pressed and folded when the man came back for it, and Nadine had no idea that the small kindness she had ironed into his collar had just bought her a future she could not yet imagine. She had taken in laundry for 11 months by then, $3 a shirt, $2 for trousers, and she pressed everything on a board set up in the corner of a one-bedroom apartment where her son slept 4 feet away. People dropped bags at her door on their way to work and picked them up on their way home. Most of them never learned her last name. She did not need them to. She needed the rent, which was $940, and she needed the light bill, and she needed the inhaler that cost her $31 even with the coupon, because her boy's chest tightened in the cold, and the cold came early that year. A single shirt was $3. To get to the rent, she had to press more than 300 of them in a month, and some months she did, and some months she came up short and carried the short part into the next month like a stone in her coat. She had a ledger she kept in the back of a spiral notebook, a column of small numbers in pencil, and on the nights the column did not add up to enough, she would sit at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low and add it again slower, as if patience could change arithmetic. It never did. Still, the adding gave her hands something to do that was not worry, and that was worth something on its own. She was 34. She had a name badge from a hospital job she had lost, and she kept it in a drawer because throwing it away felt like agreeing with the people who had let her go. Her name was Nadine Pryor, and before the layoffs she had been a sterile processing tech who could break down a surgical tray in her sleep, and after the layoffs she was a woman with an iron and a steady hand, and a son named Theo who was 9 and asked too many questions and laughed at his own jokes before he finished them. The badge in the drawer had her photograph on it from 4 years younger, a woman who did not yet know what was coming, and sometimes when she opened the drawer for a pair of scissors, she would see her own old face looking up and have to close it again. The layoffs had come on a Friday, 51 people in one afternoon, and the supervisor who delivered the news had not been able to look at her while he said it. Nadine had cleaned out her locker, turned in everything but the badge, and walked to the bus in the grey light with a cardboard box of nothing much, and she had not cried until she was home. And Theo was asleep, and there was no one to be strong in front of. She had applied to 40 places in the months after. She had sat in waiting rooms in her one good blouse, the one she pressed herself the night before each interview, and she had answered the same questions about gaps and availability and willingness, and the calls had not come. The world, it turned out, had a great deal of use for a woman who showed up early and did the job right, and almost no way to tell her apart from the stack of other women who said the same thing on the same kind of paper. So she had started pressing. It had begun with Calvin's blue uniform shirts, a favor that turned into $1, then $3, and word had moved down the bus line the way word moves through a neighborhood that cannot afford a dry cleaner. And within a season, she had a corner of her apartment that smelled of hot cotton and starch from 5 in the morning until the light went long in the afternoon. Stay with me because the shirt I told you about is going to matter more than anything else in this story. And the man who owned it did not know yet either. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a brick building near the bus line, and the radiator worked when it felt like it. Nadine had a routine that started at 5 in the morning before Theo woke, when the building was quiet and the water heater could keep up. She filled the iron, she laid out the first shirt, and she worked the point of it into the seams the way her grandmother had taught her, collar first, then the yoke, then the sleeves, then the long flat planes of the back. She did not rush. A rush shirt looked rushed, and a rush shirt did not earn a second back. She had learned that the dignity of the work was the only advertising she could afford. Her grandmother had pressed clothes for white families in another city in another decade, and she had taught Nadine the order of it before Nadine was tall enough to see over the board. "You do the collar first," the old woman had said, "because the collar is what people look at, and you do the back last, because the back is where you find out whether you have the patience to finish a thing nobody will see." Nadine had not understood it as a child. She understood it now. She thought about it most mornings, the way the steam rose off the cotton and the creases fell into place under the weight of the iron, and how a shirt that had come to her wrinkled and tired went back to its owner looking like the morning of a good day. Theo woke at 6:30 to the smell of it. He would shuffle out in his socks and sit on the floor by the board and tell her about whatever was loud in his 9-year-old mind. A dream, a kid at school, a fact about sharks he had read in a library book and needed her to know immediately. She pressed and listened. She had learned that a child does not need you to stop what you are doing to hear him. He needs you to keep doing it and hear him anyway. The way the work and the love can run in the same two hands at once. So she pressed Calvin's blue shirts and learned about sharks. And the day began, the way most of her days began, in the small, warm economy of a mother and a boy and a hot iron. Her customers were ordinary people. A bus driver named Calvin, who wore the same 4 blue uniform shirts and tipped her $1 when he could, and who had a way of knocking twice and calling her name soft so as not to startle her at the early hour. A young teacher named Pryor, who needed her blouses crisp for parent nights, and who once tried to pay double because she had heard about the radiator, and Nadine had pressed the extra money back into her hand and said the price was the price. An old man named Roosevelt, who lived alone and brought his church suit every other Saturday and always said the same thing, that his late wife used to press it and Nadine pressed it just as fine, which made her throat go tight every time because she knew what it cost him to say it. Roosevelt would sit in her kitchen while she worked and tell her about his wife, gone 6 years now, how she had ironed his suit every Saturday for 41 years and laid it across the bed Sunday morning like a gift, and Nadine would press the lapels flat and say nothing because there was nothing to say to a grief that old and that gentle, only the work of the iron and the company of another person in the room. These were her people. They did not have much, and they paid her in small bills and smaller tips, and they trusted her with the clothes they wore to the few important things their lives still held, the parent nights and the church mornings and the job interviews. And Nadine understood that to press a person's good shirt was to hold a small piece of their dignity in your hands for an hour. She did not take it lightly. She took it more seriously than the $3 could ever account for. Then there was the bag that did not belong to anyone she knew. It showed up on a Tuesday in October, a plain canvas bag with no name written on the handle, left outside her door sometime in the night. Inside were 7 dress shirts, good ones, the kind with real mother-of-pearl buttons, and a weight to the cotton that told her they had cost more than she made in a week. There was no note, there was no number. There was $42 folded inside the collar of the top shirt, which was 14 shirts worth of work for 7 shirts. And she counted it twice because she thought she had miscounted. She held the top shirt up to the window light, looked at it the way she looked at everything, with the eye of a person who had learned a trade. The stitching was machine-fine, but the cotton was the real thing, a 2-ply she could feel between her finger and thumb, the kind of shirt a man buys when a shirt is part of how he keeps his footing in the world. It had been worn soft at the collar and the cuffs the way a much-worn shirt goes soft, and that told her something too, that whoever owned these did not have many and wore the ones he had. Hard. 7 good shirts, worn thin at the edges, left at a stranger's door in the dark with too much money folded inside. It was a small mystery, and Nadine, who had no time for mysteries, set it aside and did the only thing she knew how to do with clothes, which was to make them right. She pressed them anyway. She pressed them better than anything she had pressed in months, because whoever owned these shirts had trusted a stranger with them, and trust was a thing she did not take lightly. She did the collars first, then the yokes, then the long sleeves, and she paid attention to the small things, the way the placket lay flat, the way the cuffs took a sharp fold, the points of the collar matched so they sat, even when a man buttoned his throat for a meeting that mattered. And while she was working the iron into the cuff of the 3rd shirt, she found the small tear. It was nothing, really. A half-inch split in the seam under the left arm, the kind of thing that happens when a man reaches across a desk too many times. Most people pressing for $3 a shirt would have ironed right over it and let the owner deal with it. Nadine set the iron down. She got her grandmother's sewing tin off the shelf, the one with the cracked enamel lid, and she threaded a needle by the window light and closed the tear with 11 small stitches she made invisible from the front. It took her 20 minutes. She turned the shirt inside out and matched the thread as close as her box allowed, and she ran the stitches small and even and pulled each one just snug enough to hold without puckering the cotton, and when she turned it back the right way the seam looked like it had never been open at all. It earned her nothing. She did it because a torn shirt going back to its owner felt like a lie about the care she had taken. A torn thing sent back as if it were whole was a small dishonesty, and Nadine did not have much, but she had her honesty, and she was not about to spend it on a stranger's shirt. What she did not know was whose shirt it was. What she did not know was that the man who had come for it had not slept a full night in 4 months. His name was Daniel Mercer, and he was 51, and 3 years earlier his name had been on the side of a building. He had built a logistics company from a single leased van into something that moved freight across 9 states. And then a partner he had trusted had quietly moved money that was not his to move, and the whole thing came apart in 11 weeks. The lawyers took what the partner had. Not Daniel sold the house, he sold the cars. He kept the shirts because a man going to meetings to rebuild his life needs to look like a man worth rebuilding with. And he had moved into a furnished single room 9 blocks from Nadine's building, and he had no one left to press them. He had started with 1 van and a route nobody else wanted, the overnight runs and the bad weather hauls, and he had taken them. Because a man with nothing takes the work other men refuse, he had slept in the van his first 2 years. He had learned every loading dock and every shortcut and every dispatcher's first name across half the state, and he had built the thing the slow, honest way, one satisfied customer at a time. The same way Nadine was building her corner of the world 1 pressed shirt at a time, though neither of them would have thought to put it that way. By the end he had 40 trucks and 190 people who depended on him for their rent, and he had been proud of that, prouder of the 190 than of the 40. And when it all came apart, what had kept him awake was not the house or the cars, but the faces of the people who had to be let go. The partner was a man named Hollis, whom Daniel had brought in himself, had vouched for, had handed the keys to the books, because Daniel was a man who moved freight and hated paperwork. By the time the bank called, the money was 3 countries away, and so was Hollis. And the lawyers explained to Daniel in a conference room with a long table that the law could ruin him for what another man had done in his name, and then the law did exactly that. He signed the papers, he shook the hands, he walked out of the building with his name still on the side of it for 1 more week until they took the letters down, and he watched them take the letters down from across the street because he could not make himself leave until it was finished. 3 years of meetings followed. He wore the good shirts to everyone. He sat across from men younger than him who had heard his name and heard what happened to it, and he watched them decide in the first 30 seconds that a man who had lost it once was a man who might lose it again. He was not bitter. He was tired in a way that sleep did not touch, and he had kept the 7 shirts pressed and ready the whole time by his own hand, badly scorching one and burning his knuckle on another, until the bus driver mentioned a woman near the line who pressed a shirt so clean it looked new. He had heard about her from the bus driver. Calvin had mentioned in the offhand way of bus drivers that there was a woman near the line who pressed a shirt so clean it looked new, $3, and Daniel had walked his shirts over in the dark because he did not want anyone to see how far he had fallen. He had folded the $42 into the collar because some old reflex of the man he used to be, the man who paid people well and tipped generously, had survived the wreck of everything else, and he had wanted, just once, to be that man again, even in secret. He had assumed he would never see the money or the woman again. He had assumed wrong about almost everything that year, and he was about to be wrong about this in the best way a man can be wrong. When he came back for them, on Thursday evening, the rain had started. Nadine opened the door with Theo behind her doing homework at the kitchen table, and she handed Daniel the canvas bag, and the shirts inside were pressed flat as glass and folded with the buttons up. She had wrapped them in a clean cotton sheet because she did not own tissue paper. The smell of hot cotton came out the door with the bag, and Daniel stood in the hallway in his wet coat and held it like a man being handed something more fragile than shirts. Theo looked up from his homework and looked at the man and looked back down. The quick, uninterested glance of a child, and that small, ordinary thing, a boy at a kitchen table doing his long division under a lamp, did something to Daniel he was not prepared for. He had not been inside a home with a child in it in 3 years. He had forgotten the particular warmth of it, the homework and the lamp and the smell of supper not long finished, and he stood in it for a moment longer than he needed to. He paid her the $3 a shirt they had not actually agreed on, $21, counting it out in soft bills, and she handed back the $42 she had found in the collar. He looked at the bills in her hand like he did not understand them. "That was in there," she said. "I think it fell in by mistake." It had not fallen in by mistake. He had put it there because he had felt strange leaving good shirts with a stranger, and he had wanted, in some way he could not have explained, to be generous to someone while he still could. He had assumed she would keep it. Almost anyone would have kept it. $42 to a woman pressing shirts for $3 was not nothing. Was a week of breathing room. Was the inhaler and the light bill both. And she was holding it out to him in the doorway as if keeping it had never once crossed her mind. "You mended one," he said instead, because he had noticed that morning, dressing for a meeting, the seam under his arm that had been torn for a month and was now closed so cleanly he had run his thumb over it twice. He had stood in front of the small mirror in his rented room with his arm raised, feeling for the tear he knew was there and not finding it. And he had sat down on the edge of the bed and not been able to say why his eyes stung. "It was coming apart," Nadine said. "I had thread." That was all she said. She did not tell him it had taken 20 minutes. She did not tell him she had stayed up to do it. She did not raise the value of what she had done, because to her it had no value worth raising. It was just a torn thing made whole the way she made torn things whole, because that was who she was. She took the $42 back into her own hand when he would not, and she set it on the small table by the door where she kept the bags, and she told him it would be here whenever he wanted it. And Daniel understood that arguing with this woman about money was a thing he was going to lose. Daniel walked home in the rain with $21 lighter in his pocket and $42 back in it. And he sat on the edge of a rented bed in a furnished room, and for the first time in 4 months he did not feel like a man the world had thrown away. He felt like a man someone had taken the time to mend. He brought his shirts back the next week and the week after, and the truth was he had only 7 shirts and did not need them, pressed that often, but he found reasons. He brought a tablecloth he did not own a table for. He brought a coat with a button gone. And every time Nadine pressed and mended and handed back whatever money she found that was not hers, and every time Daniel left a little more sure that he had stumbled onto one of the few honest things left in his life. He learned the shape of her days without meaning to. He learned that she pressed from 5 until the light went long, that Theo had asthma and a library card, and a way of needing his mother and pretending he did not, that the radiator was unreliable and the landlord worse. He learned that she said grace over a thin supper as if it were a feast, plainly, her hand on her boy's head, and that she did not complain, not once, not about the layoffs, or the landlord, or the column of penciled numbers that did not add up. He had known wealthy men who complained more about a delayed flight than this woman complained about a life that would have flattened most people he knew. He did not tell her who he had been. She did not ask. In her apartment he was just a quiet man with good shirts and sad eyes who always said thank you like he meant it, and to a woman pressing clothes for $3 apiece, a customer who said thank you like he meant it was worth more than the $3. There was a thing between them that did not have a name, the recognition of one careful person by another, 2 people who did their small work well and asked the world for little and were given less, and it sat in the warm kitchen with them while the iron hissed and Theo did his homework, and it asked nothing of either of them. And that was why it could grow. Have you ever done a small kindness for a stranger and never learned what it became? Hold that, because Nadine was about to find out what hers became. Winter came down hard in December. The radiator gave out entirely on the coldest week, and the landlord, a man named Burke who owned 4 buildings and answered none of his calls, let it sit broken for 9 days. Nadine pressed in her coat, her breath showing in the apartment, the iron, the only warm thing in the room, and her hands cupping over it between shirts. Theo did his homework under 2 blankets, and she heard the small catch in his breathing start 3 days in, and tried to tell herself it was nothing. She boiled water on the stove and let it steam the kitchen. She kept him close to the iron. She did the math of the inhaler against the rent and the light bill and chose wrong. The way poverty makes you choose wrong by giving you only wrong choices. And she stretched the last of the inhaler 1 day too far. And on the 8th night, His chest closed up the way it did, the wheeze going high and thin, the sound she had learned to dread above every other sound in the world, and the inhaler was empty because she had been stretching the last of it, and she had $11 to her name, and the urgent care wanted $140 just to be seen. She held the empty inhaler and shook it as if shaking it could make it not be empty, and Theo looked up at her with the wide, calm eyes children get when they are too scared to be scared, trusting her to fix it, and there was nothing in the apartment to fix it with. She wrapped Theo in the blankets and carried him down the 2 flights to the bus stop because she did not have a car, and the bus was 20 minutes out in the cold, the schedule thinned for the late hour, and her boy's breathing was getting worse against her shoulder, each breath a small mountain he had to climb. And she did the math no parent should ever have to do, the math of $11 against $140, and she felt the bottom of her life drop open. She prayed at the bus stop. She did not pray for money or for rescue. She prayed the only prayer a mother has at the bottom, which is just a name, said over and over, her son's name, into the cold, as if the saying of it could keep him breathing until the bus came. Daniel found them there. He was walking home from a meeting that had gone the way all his meetings went lately, which was nowhere. His collar up against the wind, and he saw a woman he knew bent over a child at a bus stop in 14-degree cold, and he crossed the street without thinking. He did not have much. He had a working phone and a man he had once done a favor for, who happened to run a clinic, a man whose own business Daniel had carried through a hard winter years ago. When carrying it cost Daniel money he could have kept. He made one call. He said a name and said please and said he would explain later, and 20 minutes later Theo was on a nebulizer in a warm room, and his breathing was coming back down to something a mother could stand to listen to, the high, thin wheeze loosening, the small chest rising easier, the worst of it passing the way the worst of it passes when help comes in time. Nadine sat in a plastic chair and shook, not from the cold anymore, and Daniel sat beside her and did not say anything wise, because there was nothing wise to say. He just stayed. When the clinic asked who would cover the visit, he gave them a card from a wallet that held very little else and told them to bill him, and Nadine started to protest and he stopped her with 4 words. "You mended my shirt," he said. She did not understand then that he meant it as a whole accounting. That in his mind a torn seam closed with 11 invisible stitches by a woman who expected nothing had been the moment a wrecked man decided the world might still be worth standing back up in. She thought he was being kind about a small thing. She did not know. The small thing had been load-bearing. The radiator got fixed 2 days later, and Nadine never learned that a quiet man had called the city's housing office and a building inspector had appeared at Burke's door with a citation and a deadline. She only knew that the heat came back. She thanked God for it the way she thanked God for most things, plainly and without expecting an answer. January was lean. February was leaner. The shirts kept coming $3 apiece, and Nadine kept pressing, and Theo got stronger as the weather turned, and somewhere in there Daniel stopped being a customer in her mind and started being something closer to a friend, though neither of them said the word. He started staying for the coffee she offered, out of politeness. He helped Theo with the long division homework that made the boy cry, sitting on the floor by the ironing board with a pencil and a patience he had not known he still had, drawing the problem out as boxes and groups, until the boy's face cleared and he said, "Oh," like a small door opening. He fixed the wobble in her ironing board with a shim of folded cardboard and a screwdriver he brought from his room. He never once mentioned money, and she never once asked what he did, and the not asking was its own kind of respect between two people who had both lost more than they let on. Theo took to him the way a fatherless boy takes to a steady man, carefully, and then all at once he saved up his shark facts for Daniel's visits. He showed him the library books. And Daniel, who had no children of his own and had thought that ship long sailed, found that an hour on the floor of a cold apartment helping a 9-year-old understand remainders was the best hour of his week, better than any meeting, better than the old days he sometimes still missed. He did not tell Nadine that either. There were a great many things the two of them did not say, and the kitchen held them all without strain. Then in March the thing happened that closed the gap. A man Daniel had known in the old life. A freight broker named Wendell, who had ridden out the collapse with his own company intact, came looking for Daniel because the industry was short on people who knew how to move things, and Daniel had once been the best at it. Wendell trekked him to the furnished room. He offered Daniel a position running operations for a regional carrier, real money, the kind of money that would put a man's name back on the side of something. And Daniel, who had spent 3 years being told he was finished, sat across from his old colleague and felt the floor of his life come back up to meet his feet. He took the job. And the first thing he did, with the first real paycheck, was not buy a car or a house or a single thing for himself. He came to Nadine's door on a Saturday morning in a pressed shirt she recognized because she had pressed it, and he asked if he could take her and Theo to breakfast. She almost said no. She was behind on the week's bags, and $3 was $3. Theo, though, was already pulling on his shoes, and the boy had not been to a restaurant in over a year, and she did not have the heart to take that away from him. At the diner over eggs, Theo ate like a boy who had been hungry, longer than a 9-year-old should ever be hungry. Daniel told her the truth. Not all at once. He told her about the company he had built and the partner who had taken it and the 3 years of meetings that went nowhere. He told her about the one van and the night, sleeping in it, and the 190 people he had let go and could not stop seeing. He told her he had walked his shirts to her door in the dark because he had been ashamed that a man who had once paid 190 salaries could not bear for anyone to watch him hand over 7 shirts and count out $21. And he told her about the night he had dressed for a meeting and run his thumb over a seam that a stranger had mended for nothing, and how that had been the night he decided to keep trying. "You don't know what you did," he said. "You couldn't have known. I had decided I was done. I had decided the world had made up its mind about me, and there was no point arguing. And then I felt that seam, that thing you fixed and never mentioned and never charged me for, and I thought, somebody in this city still does a thing right when nobody is watching and nobody is paying. And if she can, I can." He turned his coffee cup a slow half circle on the table. "I have sat across from a lot of important people in 3 years. Not one of them gave me what you gave me with 11 stitches. Nadine sat very still. She had not raised her voice once in this whole story, and she did not raise it now. She looked at her son, finishing his eggs, and she looked at the man across from her, and she said the only true thing she had. "I had thread," she said. "That's all it was." "It was not all it was," Daniel said. "It was never all it was." He told her then what he had come to say. The carrier he now ran had a processing and supply division, and they needed someone who understood sterile handling and inventory, and the patient discipline of doing a thing correctly the first time, and he had thought of exactly one person in the world. He had not made the job for her out of pity. He had made it because he had watched a woman press 300 shirts a month without a single shortcut and mend a stranger's seam for nothing. And he knew, the way you know a thing in your bones, that she would be the most reliable person in any building she walked into. The salary he named was more money than Nadine Pryor had made in any year of her life. It came with benefits. It came with an inhaler that would cost her nothing. It came with a future in which her son's chest closing in the cold was an inconvenience and not a catastrophe. She did not take it right away. She was not a woman who grabbed at things, even good things, even the things she had prayed for in plain words on cold nights. She asked him quietly if she could earn it, if it was real work and not a gift dressed up as work. And Daniel told her the truest thing he knew, which was that the only gift in it was that he had been lucky enough to find her. First, she started in April. She was good at it the way he had known she would be. She broke down processes that had been sloppy for years. She caught an inventory error in her second week that had been costing the division thousands, a double-counted lot that no one had thought to question, because no one had bothered to look, and she looked the way she looked at a shirt all the way to the back where the patience shows. The people who had worked there for a decade learned her last name within a month and said it with respect, which was a thing Nadine had not heard attached to her name since the hospital let her go, and she had forgotten how it felt, like sun on the back of your neck after a long winter indoors. A younger woman on her team started coming in early just to watch how Nadine set up her station, and Nadine taught her the order of it without ever once mentioning that she had learned it on shirts. You do the most seen thing first and the unseen thing last, and you do the unseen thing as carefully as the rest, because that is where you find out who you are. She kept the ironing board. She did not need it anymore, but she kept it set up in the corner where it had always been, and on Sunday evenings she still pressed Theo's school shirts for the week, collar first, then the yoke, then the sleeves, because some things you keep doing not because you have to, but because they are part of who you are. By the next winter, they had moved a two-room on a quiet street, with a radiator that worked and a window in Theo's room that caught the morning light. Theo had a desk now, and a bookshelf, and a chest that no longer closed up at the first sign of cold, because warmth was no longer something his mother had to ration. Roosevelt, the old man, still brought his church suit by, not because Nadine charged him any more, she would not take his money, but because he liked to sit in her warm kitchen and tell her his late wife would have pressed it just the same, and Nadine would smooth the lapels flat and agree. Daniel Mercer's name went back on the side of a building that spring. He sent Nadine a photograph of it, and she put it on the refrigerator next to Theo's spelling tests, and when people asked her who that was, she said simply, "A friend who came back for a shirt." She still had her grandmother's sewing tin, the one with the cracked enamel lid. She kept it on the shelf above the new ironing board in the new apartment, and one evening, Theo, 11 now and tall for it, asked her why she kept an old tin. She barely used. Nadine took it down. She opened it. The needle was still threaded from the last seam she had closed, months ago now, and she held it up to the warm kitchen light so her son could see the thread catch. "A man once thought his life was over," she said, and I closed a tear in his shirt. 11 stitches. He couldn't even see them from the front. She set the tin back on the shelf and pressed the lid down with her thumb until the cracked enamel clicked. You never know which small thing you do is the one that holds somebody up. So you do all of them like they might be. Theo thought about that the way 11-year-olds think about things, which is to say he filed it away without fully understanding it, and went back to his homework at the desk he had not had a year ago, in the warm room he had not had a year ago, in the life his mother's steady hands had pressed flat and whole one shirt at a time. And the tin sat on the shelf in the lamplight, the needle still threaded, ready for the next torn thing that came to her door.